you were to see your brand as a family, right? So if your brand was consistent, then that means that everyone is a twin.
Hello, friends, and welcome to another episode of Coffee with Tea. My name is Tonia Tyler, and I'm excited because I'm going to talk to Mr. Egesi, and we're going to talk about the 5 key elements of a successful brand. But before we dive into our conversation, I want to welcome Mr. Eddie to the show. Welcome, sir.
Great, thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you here. We've connected on a few times. You do great work on your website and building your brand. And so thank you for accepting this invitation to come on and talk about your services.
Sure.
So please, I want to open up the call. It's a simple question. Tell a little bit about who you are and what you do there, sir.
Yeah, so my name is Eddie Egesi, and I'm a branding expert, web designer, and founder of Apricot Branding, which is a strategic branding and design firm based in Maryland. So I help clients to really clarify their message and, gain a better understanding of their customers and really develop their brand's design, their brand's messaging, and their online presence so that they could really connect with their audience and get better results on their marketing efforts.
I love it. Like I said, I love your story. I like Confidence Drives is all about the transitions of things. Like, how do we get from here to there? And so when I was reading, you said your name reflects the transition into more strategic branding firms and merges creative thinking with strategic insight. So,
Mhm.
can you explain a little bit about how this concept came to you? I mean, where does this passion of helping strategically brand your message come out for you?
Yeah, so it all started from my background in the creative field, right? And then I just started to like a lot of the success that I saw was from collaboration. So I just used to collaborate with people in the marketing. And then that way I got introduced to like different business owners and I started to learn a little bit more. And I found that just the creative alone wasn't enough. So I also needed to like merge it and be more strategic as well. Right. So the way I see it is like um creativity is like the spicing in your business, right? So if your business was a food, creativity is like the spicing, right? So by itself, the spicing may not seem very potent, but when it's added to the food, that's where it gets its power from, right? That's where the power comes from. So by merging that creativity with a strategic aspect, you're able to really drive some great results for businesses, right?
Yeah, I like it. So it's like it takes planning, first of all, because I know a lot of our business owners get out there. I was one of those, just get out there and we just start throwing in the spices, right? Just throwing in everything, but we're really not strategically thinking, or maybe we're not even reading the recipe card to see what it calls for. Is what I'm hearing from your analogy with the spices, because it makes sense that way.
Yeah, I use great analogies. Yeah.
So yeah, thank you for sharing that, because like I said, adding the strategic branding, and for those who don't know, and I always like the clarity of explaining what the strategic. So yeah, I can get the analogy as a cook, as I used to cook, adding the right spaces can make or break a business, if you per se.
Yeah, yeah. And I was also inspired by like other companies, I don't know if you've heard of Profit, but it's like another branding firm or like people like Bruce Mao. So these were all people that I really looked up to and really inspired me to launch my own business as well. So
Right. So before we dive into the key elements, is one thing that I'm hearing, and maybe correct me as we get into the 5 elements. One of the key things is the spice of collaboration is what I'm hearing, and that might be on your key element. So I don't want to take anything away, but how important is collaboration when building your business these days?
yeah, well, the best way to look at it is building a business is a team sport, right? It's basically a sport. That's what it boils down to. Right. So it's all about collaboration, right? So if you look at successful brands and the story of how they were started and you pay attention, you would see that most of the time, if not all the time, there were lots of collaborations going on the back end, right? So they were collaborating with other companies, collaborating with nonprofits, collaborating with celebrities, right? So that's a really crucial part, like, of your whole brand building is having that people that you can reach out to and collaborate with. So
Okay. Well, like again, I don't know all your key elements, which we're about to dive into, but I like that, and I want to emphasize there is a difference between collaboration versus competition, and we're not going to really dive into that right now. But what's let's get into your 5 key elements, because 20 minutes does go by real quick. So, what's your first key element of a successful brand that you'd like to leave us with?
Yeah, so the first key element is an emotional connection, right? So a brand is like a person's gut feeling about your business or organization. So it's how they feel about it in their gut, right? Because most people, they don't make very logical decisions because it's too much work. So like think of it as like politics, right? So so branding is like an election, right? So customers, you're voting with your dollars. So when we think about people like maybe like Joe Biden or like Donald Trump, when most people vote for these people, right, you're not looking at the details, right, in your policies, right? Most people, they're not looking at the specific details because it's too much work. So most people, they just vote based on how they feel about that person or that person's character, right?
Mhm.
So that's a huge part of it is just how they feel about that person and if that person feels authentic to them, right? So there has to be that emotional connection, right? So if you only focus on like the functional benefits and all these different features, you're gonna bore people really quickly, right? So
So, Mr. Eddie, how do we work on building our emotional connection with our clients?
yeah, I'm actually going to be giving a talk on this later, right? So one way we can really build that emotional hook, like the first step I would say is to first like understand your audience. Like, so what brands do they already love and why? Right?
Oh,
Right? That would give you insight into like their emotional needs. Like, so what are your emotional needs? They might not tell you, but you can uncover it, right? Their underlying emotional needs, because that's what it's all about. It's about filling those emotional needs that they may have that other people may not be fulfilling, right? So when you really focus on the emotional aspect, you're able to uncover like so many different ways that you can differentiate your brand, right? Which leads us on to the next one, the next key element, which is differentiation, right? So once you understand your emotional needs, you can uncover different ways to really differentiate your brand from others and make people feel in a way that other people don't, right? And then that way your brand has an important place in their lives, right? So customers, they're looking for brands that feel that make life more interesting to them and
mhm.
that really like make them feel in ways that other people don't, right? So some examples of brands that really pull on those heartstrings are like maybe brands like Dove. So they try to make women feel better about themselves. And this could be seen in every aspect of your business, from your advertising campaigns to your different programs, right? So these are just like that's just one example, right, of like a brand that does a really good job at creating that emotional connection,
Right.
right?
I love it because, and what I'm picking up too is going back to your first one. You're talking about your emotional connection is understanding your brand. As you have to do some research. That's what I'm
Mhm,
hearing. You have to know, who you are, and then when you're talking about the differential, what makes you different. So knowing who you're talking to, how
mhm,
can you connect with them? And I'm rephrasing so I can understand for myself, and then actually putting into work to research more about yourself, plus how do you connect with your brand? And then too, when you say the differential is like covering the brands, and you're again doing your research, because if you know what brands they are attracted to, then you can
mhm,
actually say without like competition wise, what makes you different? Is that what
mhm,
I'm hearing? It's sort of like you're doing like a strategic walkthrough of how
mhm.
to put this plan together and knowing what spice to add at the right time. Is this what I'm hearing?
Yeah, yeah. So it's all just focused on your audience, right? Those customers and like what subliminal emotional needs do they have? Like for example, they might be looking for more freedom, or they might have certain fears that they're trying to mitigate, right? Or they might have what else? What are some other examples of emotional needs? They might be looking to
Meaning,
yeah, more meaning,
purpose.
might be looking to feel empowered, right? So when you look at these successful brands, you would see that they all have like an emotional need that they tap into most of the time. Yeah.
Right. Great. Thank you. So, I'm not trying to know what's number 3 on our list.
Wait, before we get to number 3, let me just finish up number 2.
Okay.
So number 2 is the differentiation. So there are different levels of differentiation, right? There are different levels. So differentiation can mean like how you differentiate your brand as a whole, right? What makes it different from others? Differentiation can be like what differentiates your product from others, right? It can be what differentiates each of your services from others. It could be what differentiates your messaging from others. So there's so many different levels of differentiation. So it's kind of like going through these different aspects of your brand and just figuring out like, what makes our product unique, what makes our services unique, and, what makes our brand as a whole unique. And a lot of times it might take just reaching out to customers and asking them. That's if your brand is already well known. You might even ask them like, what makes, what makes our brand unique to you, right? Or what do you value the most when you're choosing one brand over another, right? And that's how you can really differentiate your brand. Another really good way to differentiate your brand is through content, right? So like in the old world, when people will be trying to reach out to customers, they would just advertise and say, this is what we have, this is the cost, buy now, right? But in today's world, that old model is dead, right? So you can't just appeal to people by just saying this is what we have by now. So nowadays you have to release the content that your customers are looking for online, right? And through that content, you can actually compete with other larger companies, right? And you could even rank higher than larger companies, right? With really good content.
Right. So
Yeah.
this was a really good conversation, and we
Yeah.
can dive. I'm going to definitely ask Mr. Ed to come back because we can talk about different. I guess we could talk about each category separately, but I want to make sure we cover all 5 bases. And I also
Sure.
want to remind everybody that Mr. Eddie has been dropping nuggets. So if you've been picking them up like I have, make sure you hit that like button down there. Maybe follow up with a comment below, because now maybe ask what's number 3.
All right. So number 3 is coherence, right?
Coherence.
Coherence. So a lot of people talk about consistency, but I feel like coherence is more important than consistency, right? So I'll use another analogy, right? So let's say your brand was like a family, right? Let's say you were to see your brand as a family, right? So if your brand was consistent, then that means that everyone is a twin, right? But if your brand is coherent, it means that everyone looks related, right? So that's the difference. So I feel like coherence is more important for everything to look like have that thread that runs through everything. So so a lot of people, they just focus on only the logo. So like I have a logo, I have a website, and then now I have a brand. But that's not how it works, right? So it's more about looking at like other ways, right, that people could identify your brand. And that's another way that you can really differentiate yourself. So for example, what kind of photography do you use, right? That makes you unique, right? How would you describe your product photography, right? And like even the design of your products, right? If you have a physical product or like a software, right?
Mhm.
Does it feel cohesive, right? Does it have a unique look,
Right.
right? And that's another way that you could really differentiate yourself is by creating that sense of cohesiveness, right? From how you communicate to how your brand looks visually and just going beyond the logo, like, and just looking at like how else can people really identify us, right?
Right.
And
Right.
creating, so I'll use another analogy, right? So a customer is kind of like trying to catch an animal, right? So,
Okay.
yeah. So like, for example, if you want to catch, give me an example of an animal,
A deer.
like a deer, right? So you have to, so deers, they tend to like certain environments. They like to be in certain environments, right? So if you want to attract deer, right, it has to feel very cohesive, right? So you're creating that environment so that your customer feels comfortable.
I like the analogy.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, because like say you got to make them feel welcome and come on in. So yeah.
Yeah. So you can't like catch a polar bear in like West Africa, right? So
Right.
So there are certain trees that you will find, right? There are certain types of, um, certain types of plants. So it's like you're creating like an ecosystem for your customers to feel comfortable, right? So when they browse your website, it should feel very cohesive. Like it should feel like I belong here. This is where I belong,
Right.
right?
I like that. Thank you.
Yeah,
I know I'm keeping an eye on the time, and I want to make sure we cover all five bases. So, and like I said, we're going to have a deeper. I'm going to have you invite you back at least. Hopefully, you'll accept. But what's
yeah,
number 4?
yeah. And then number 4 is authenticity, right? Authenticity. So nowadays, like customers, with so many options out there, you're looking for brands that feel authentic, right? That leads me back to my first point about the messaging, right? Unlike elections. So like most people, they don't vote based on the details. They just looking for the candidate that feels very authentic to them,
Right.
right? So your brand really needs to look and feel authentic. And then one way you can tell if your brand looks and feels authentic is if people are trying to copy you, right? So everyone is trying to like copy like these well-known brands, but even if they have the same thing, people still want the real thing. They want the real deal. They don't want a copy, right? So your brand has to feel authentic. So the ultimate goal of branding is to get people to conclude that we're beyond just what they're selling, what we're selling, right? So Nike is beyond just selling shoes, right? Starbucks is beyond just coffee, right? Your coffee isn't just regular coffee, right? So once you get people to conclude that you're the real deal and like you're beyond just what you're offering, then that's when I would say that you're successfully branded,
Okay.
right?
Is so. I mean, I don't want to jump to the last one. Number 5. What's number 5
Yeah,
on it?
yeah. And then number 5 is just crystal clarity, right? Crystal clarity. So clarity is a huge thing. Like, so it could be both internal or it could be external clarity. So in terms of internal clarity, you just got to be clear about like where you're looking to take your brand and exactly what you're trying to do. It may seem obvious, but I've come across so many different people that have no idea what you're doing or even what branding is even about, right? So
Right.
yeah. So you got to be clear about what you're trying to do and like who your customers are,
Right.
right? Which leads me to the next point about like, maybe like catching animals. So if you're trying to catch every single animal, it's going to be really different, right? Because people, they have different behaviors, like different ways of thinking, things like that. But if you focus on one animal, like fish,
Mhm.
then you know exactly where to find them and it becomes much easier. So you have to be really crystal clear about who exactly you're trying to target. And then they have to be clear about you as well, right? You got to be clear about the problem you solve for them, and they have to be clear about the problem you solve for them as well,
Right.
right? And what makes you different from all the others, in the market. So they
Right.
have to be crystal clear, and you have to be clear as well. So it's just about just having a clear message and just having a clear brand because customers, our brains, we naturally gravitate towards things that are easier to understand,
Mhm.
right? So because people's lives are really complicated, so if your brand is all over the place, you're just adding to the noise, right? And you're gonna avoid you, right?
Right.
But if your brand is easier to understand, then you're naturally gonna attract people to you because you're just simpler off option that's much more clear to them.
Right. I like I said, you have dropped so many juicy nuggets on this one, and like I said, this is so good. I would definitely want to have you come back if you're willing to. But before we wrap it up, and like I said, you gave us a lot of food for thought here. What's the one thing you want people to take away from your message today? If there's nothing else that they hear from you today.
Yeah, so I would suggest that they just take a moment to just review your brand, like. And so, for example, you could review your website, right? For example, like what's the emotional, does your website convey the emotional experience, right? That customers receive, the emotional outcome, right? How do you want your brand to make people feel? And, are you really conveying that through your messaging, right? And like, what makes how can you really further differentiate your brand? You can look at your different services, your different products, and how can you make them more unique, right? More differentiated. And like just looking at your brand, right? Does it feel coherent, right? And does it fit the target audience, right? And then does it feel authentic, right? And does it, is it clear, like most importantly? So, because you might find it clear, but other people, they're actually having a really hard time understanding it.
Right.
Right?
So yeah, like I said, I'm gonna Like I said, thank you for recovering those 5 points. And like I
Mhm.
said, the crystal clear part. And I like I said, the analogies really, I loved your analogies. I just wanted to share with
Yeah.
that. So, Mr. Eddie, where can people find more information about you, your services, and what you do?
Yeah, so my website is apricotbranding.com. So apricot, like the color, and then branding.com. And I also have a blog if you want to learn more about branding. And I also have a free download called The 5 Branding Mistakes to Avoid that anyone can get from my website. So, yeah.
Again, thank you so much. And like I said, my unofficial question is, would you be willing to come back and maybe we can have a deeper conversation about some of these topics that you talked about?
Yeah, absolutely. Sure.
Thank you. And again, I want to thank you for sharing your insight and your wisdom. Because, like I said, the knowledge alone to me, I already picked up a couple of like, the right spices and stuff and figuring out what animal I'm catching. So, thank you for those. I really appreciate that. And
Yeah,
again,
yeah.
and I want to say, again, thank you for your time and your insight that you shared with us there, sir.
Yeah, absolutely. Sure.
And I want to remind everybody who tuned in that yes, feedback is always welcome. Yes, with Mr. Eddie, we just touched the surface on that thing, and he dropped a lot of nuggets. So please make sure you check out those new juicy gems down. He's dropping down there his website and information and this blog that you can check out in the description because it'll be down there below. Again, if you picked up a lot of the nuggets that he shared, picked up on the analogies, and maybe figure out how you can use this more strategically, make sure you hit that like button. And again, if you want to continue getting the insights that Mr. Eddie shared today and others that come on, please make sure you hit that subscribe button. And again, take things in stride, go with the flow, and create your own path. And we will see you back here on another episode of Coffee with Tea. All right. Bye bye.